They said I wasn't worthy of their son, that I was just a common girl, with nothing but dreams. They looked at me as if I were a blemish on the perfect life they had planned for their son. I'll never forget that look of disdain from his mother, or the cold nod from the rich, powerful father. They didn't hit me, didn't curse me, but the way they laughed as I walked out of their house for the last time, after a tearful farewell to the man I loved, said it all. I would never, ever, be allowed to set foot in their family again. The thing was, I wasn't going to either. Because a few years later, that proud father, the one who had said I would never amount to anything in life, was sitting in my office, head bowed, begging for a job opportunity. And you know what? I was the one who decided his fate. Welcome to Judgy Tales, where we not only tell real-life stories from Reddit, but also shine a light on them with unflinching, uncompromising justice. This is where the underdogs rise up, the twists and turns are breathtaking, and each situation is a reminder that karma sometimes comes sooner than you think. If you love satisfying revenge stories, underdog-turned-victory comebacks, then you've come to the right place. Back to my story. It wasn't just a broken relationship. It was a long series of prejudice, classism, and vicious prophecies from a family that believed money and power gave them the right to judge others. I loved that boy with all the sincerity a young girl could muster. We met when we were students. I worked part-time at a small coffee shop, and he came from a well-off family. But back then, love overshadowed all distances. Until I was invited to a family dinner. That night was a turning point. From his mother's judgmental gaze, to the trick questions about my future career, my realistic dreams, and finally the bluntest statement from my father, if you really love him, it's best to let him find someone of his own. I swallowed that humiliation. And when my boyfriend didn't dare stand up for me in front of his parents, I knew. I hadn't just lost love, I had just embarked on a journey to prove them wrong, every sentence, every word. I threw myself into my work, starting at the bottom of a small marketing agency. I worked every day, learned digital branding in the evenings, started taking freelance gigs in my spare time, and slowly built up a client base. There was no magic bullet, just sweat, sleepless nights, and a single-minded determination. I would become someone they couldn't ignore anymore. Then, an opportunity arose when a former company I had worked for was going through a restructuring. I seized the opportunity, raised money, and officially launched my own agency. It started out as 3 people in a cramped room, but within 2 years, we had signed a major contract with a well-known retail chain, expanded rapidly, and, ironically, my father's former company became a small competitor in front of us. Did you guess the rest? One fine day, I received an email from a stranger applying for a marketing project consultant position. I opened my CV, and almost laughed out loud. It was him. The man who said I wasn't good enough to walk into his house was now looking for a way into my company. And you know what's best? I invited him for an interview. This story is not just about sweet revenge. It is a reminder to everyone who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, that sometimes silence is the most powerful revenge. And success is the most painful slap. Don't take your eyes off today's video, because you don't want to miss every bitter, yet satisfying detail. This is Judgy Tales, where justice is in the air, and every judgment is returned, at the right time, to the right person. I grew up in a normal family. Not so poor that we had to skip meals, but there was nothing called extra either. My parents were hard-working people, who all their lives only hoped that their children would get a college degree so that they could have a better life in the future. I was an only child, so all the family's hopes and savings were focused on me. From a young age, I knew that every penny of my parents' college tuition was their sweat and tears. They opened a small restaurant, worked from dawn to dusk, and sometimes had to borrow a little to maintain the shop during the off-season. Even so, they still did not touch the money they had set aside for me, my college fund, as my mother called it. It was the only thing that was not allowed to be spent, unless it was for my future. And I cherished that more than anything. I am not the type of girl who stands out. I don't have a fancy car, I don't wear designer clothes, and I don't post glamorous pictures on social media. I am the type of person who works hard, studies quietly, works part-time when I can, and dreams of one day becoming an expert in the financial industry. I love numbers, I love their logic and precision, and I believe that if I try hard, I will have a stable life. Not too extravagant, just safe enough for my parents to rest after a lifetime of hard work. Then I met Ryan, a guy who was almost my opposite in every way. He came from a wealthy family, studied in the same department but in a different class, and stood out from the first time he appeared. Ryan was the type of guy who easily attracted attention. Polite, confident, handsome, and always knew how to make the other person feel special. I never thought he would pay attention to someone like me. But the unexpected happened. Ryan took the initiative to talk to me, invited me out for coffee after class, and we gradually became close. Not long after, we started dating. I don't know if it was love, fate, or just a cruel twist of life. But when I fell in love, I trusted him absolutely. I told him about my family, about how hard my parents worked to save money for me to go to school. I never hid or was ashamed of my background, because I always believed that effort is what makes a person valuable. At first, Ryan seemed to appreciate it. He said he loved my honesty, loved the way I looked at the world with simplicity. But gradually, I began to realize that something was wrong. Our outings began to have an invisible distance. Ryan was still sweet, but sometimes he would say things that hurt me without him realizing it. You should try to dress a little better, my mother really cares about appearance, or stop talking about money, you talk about it and it makes me feel stressed. I ignored it, thinking that love requires compromise. I began to try to change myself. Save money to buy some more expensive clothes, try to talk less about tuition, and try to act as if I was not so different from the world Ryan belonged to. Then the day came to meet Ryan's parents. They invited me to dinner at their home. A villa in the suburbs, so quiet and luxurious that I felt out of place from the moment I walked in. His mother was the kind of woman who was coldly perfect. Her hair was untangled, her voice was soft but sharp as a knife. His father, a successful businessman, looked calm and somewhat thoughtful, as if he had seen the world and was tired of it all. I tried my best to make a good impression, spoke politely, smiled at the right times, not too shy but not too ostentatious. But at first sight, I knew they would not accept me. That evening was a secret interview that I was not informed of. They asked me what I studied, what my plans were after graduation, what my family did, how much I earned, and his mother even asked me if I intended to tie Ryan down early. I smiled awkwardly and answered with all my remaining self-respect. And when everything was over, Ryan's father said something that I will never forget. You are a smart girl, I do not deny it. But I hope Ryan will be with someone of the same class. Someone who is suitable for the path we have set for him. There was no obvious insult, but it hurt more than any humiliation. I left that house feeling like I'd been slapped in the face. Ryan tried to comfort me, saying that as long as we loved each other, that was enough. But I knew he wasn't strong enough to stand by me. Gradually the distance grew. The calls became less frequent, the last-minute cancellations more frequent, and then a cold text message. I think we should stop. You're a great person, but I'm probably not good enough for you. A sophistry lie that everyone has heard. I was hurt, not just from losing Ryan, but from feeling ignored, judged, excluded from someone's life because I didn't come from the same background. I was depressed for a few weeks. But then I remembered my parents, who hadn't eaten a full breakfast in 18 years so I could sit in a college lecture hall. I remembered their college fund, their lifelong dream, and I knew I couldn't stay down forever. I threw myself into my studies. I worked part-time, taking any job I could get so I wouldn't drop out. And then one day, as I was getting ready for my senior year, my mother said, "We need to talk." I thought it was about tuition, but it wasn't. My college fund was gone, she said. A close relative had borrowed the entire amount during our hard times without telling anyone. He promised to pay it back, but then disappeared. I couldn't believe my ears. It wasn't that I was dependent on the money. It was that it was all my parents had saved, and because of it, my future could be pushed back forever. Cried, my mother cried. My father just sat there, silent, as if the world had collapsed. But I didn't give up. I took out student loans, applied for scholarships, took on extra jobs. I once worked 3 jobs at once, just to pay for school. I slept 3 hours a day, lived on instant noodles, and studied like my life depended on it. All to prove that I didn't need anyone to be anyone. I graduated with honors, got accepted into a top financial firm, and worked my way up to a management position in just 3 years. In my 4th year I started my own company. It was small at first, just me and 2 of my classmates, but after a big contract with an international chain, we grew rapidly. And then fate came knocking. I received a CV, a candidate for a strategic consulting position. They said they had a lot of experience, had run many multi-million-dollar projects, but were looking for a young, dynamic environment to develop their career again. I opened the attached file and almost dropped my coffee. His name was Richard B. Ryan's father. The man who looked at me like I was scum. The man who said I didn't belong in his world. Now he was asking for a job in the company I built with his own contempt. And I was the one who would decide whether he got in or not. And this is just the beginning. Life has strange twists and turns. You never know when things will start to change. For me, it wasn't a big meeting. It wasn't when my company signed its first $1 million contract. It wasn't when I saw Richard B.'s name on my resume.
Well,
It all started at a party that seemed completely unrelated to me. Until I realized I was the one being ridiculed. That evening, an old friend of mine invited me to a fundraising dinner for a non-profit at a posh hotel in the city. I'm not a big fan of parties, especially when they're usually filled with familiar faces from the upper echelons. People who used to make me feel small, people who thought they were born to be at the top of the pyramid. But the friend was so keen, I agreed to go as a social occasion. I knew from the moment I walked in that I would see some old names. In the middle of the hall, a group of people surrounded a man. And sure enough, it was Ryan. He looked no different than he did in college. Still in a neat suit, still with that charming smile that made you forget what was underneath. But it wasn't him that stopped me. It was the person standing next to him. His fiancée. And what I heard next made my blood run cold. Do you remember that girl back then, the one poor, but always dreamed of becoming a CEO? Everyone burst into laughter after that. And I knew exactly who they were talking about.
Me.
I don't know if any of them had noticed my presence, but I stood there, speechless, while Ryan continued jokingly. Yeah, she was ambitious. But not everyone can do it. She might be working as an accountant somewhere now. I left the party before anyone saw me. But inside me, the feeling was no longer hurt. It was fire. A fire that had been smoldering for years, and now it was burning into a flame. They were still the same. Arrogant, contemptuous, and thinking that the whole world revolved around their prejudices. They thought I had disappeared, that I had been drowned by poverty, by failure. They had never really looked back to see that I had long since surpassed them. And if they had forgotten me, then perhaps it was time to remind them. In a way they never expected. A few weeks later, Ryan's father, Richard B., walked into my office, unaware that my company had been shortlisted for a major consulting contract for his corporation. I had let HR arrange the interview as usual, without telling anyone about my personal connection. When he walked in, our eyes met for a moment, and I saw the shock on his face. But he quickly regained his professional composure, and I smiled, as if the past had never happened. The interview went according to procedure. He presented himself well, answered questions logically, and showed his experience and maturity. No one in the room knew anything special was going on. But I did. I knew that the man sitting in front of me was the same man who had declared me not good enough for his son, the same man who had seen me as a scum of society. And now he was asking me for a job. After the interview, I told the HR department privately that I should take a closer look at his resume before making a final decision. I wasn't going to reject him outright. I wanted to understand why a man who had run a chain of businesses was now applying for a consulting position at a relatively young company like mine. And what I found out made the story even more bitter. Richard B.'s family corporation has suffered heavy losses in the past 2 years due to misguided investments. A series of unprofitable ventures, coupled with lax management, have caused the board of shareholders to lose confidence. He was forced to step down as CEO, lose control, and retain only a few old relationships. None of his former allies want to have anything to do with him anymore. Because in that class, when you are no longer valuable, you no longer have any acquaintances. I heard from a former associate of his that Ryan, the golden son of the past, has also separated to build his own career with his future wife's money. That means Mr. Richard no longer has any support. The man who once laughed at me for being poor, who once looked at me with half an eye, now had nothing in his hands but a faded reputation. And that was when I faced him directly. No longer as CEO, HR, or partner. Just me and him, two people who once stood on opposite ends of the contempt, and now had switched places. I asked him to come to my office to discuss more about the job. But that conversation was not an interview at all. I showed him the entire development roadmap of my company. Every contract, every market expansion strategy, the numbers that would make any investor nod. I spoke not with pride, but with data. Something I had learned to love from day one. And then I placed a photo on his desk. It was a photo I had taken from that party, where he and his family were still laughing at other people's wounds. He looked at me saying nothing. But I saw in his eyes that something was broken. I said, "You used to say I wasn't good enough for your family. But it seems like now I'm the one who has to decide whether you're good enough to join my company." He was still silent. No more pride. No more condescending tone. Just the silence of a man who knows he's getting what he deserves. I didn't fire him right away. Gave him a job. But I assigned him to a small, unimportant project and put him under the supervision of a young employee fresh out of college, a person he had underestimated in his first interview. I wanted him to feel what it was like to be looked down upon, controlled, directed by someone else. Not because I was cruel, but because I believe that people need to learn the lesson of humility again. And sometimes, that lesson can only come through a path they have denied. This is when the conflict is no longer about love, honor, or status. It is the collision between the past and the present. It is the echo of the contemptuous words they once uttered, now knocking on the door. It is the clearest reflection of a simple truth. Never look down on others just because you are in a position of power. Because the wheel of time will turn, and you never know who will be sitting in the deciding seat when the final door closes. And this is only the beginning. I thought that what I had experienced since Mr. Richard Ryan's father applied to work at my company was the final climax of the story. But no. Fate also gave me a twist that even I did not expect, a reversal that if it were in a movie, people would probably laugh at it as too much to be true. But real life always knows how to surpass imagination. And I, the person who was once considered unworthy, became the center of a reversal that no one could have expected. After Richard started working for my company, I tried to keep things professional. I didn't talk down to him. I wasn't spiteful. I let him see that he was no longer at the top, but a junior employee, and even subordinate to the young people he once looked down on. There were days when he stood silently in the conference room, having his proposal edited like a clumsy intern by a 26-year-old team leader. I watched, showing no emotion. I wanted him to understand that the humiliation wasn't in the way he was treated. It was in accepting what he had once denied. Things were going well for a few weeks, until something unusual happened. One Monday morning I walked into the office to find the team buzzing. There was a Reddit post on the screen, not on r/aita or r/confession, which we usually followed for fun, but on a subreddit dedicated to exposing companies that mistreat older employees. The post was posted anonymously, but the content was familiar. Former CEO forced into substandard work by new company, managed by ignorant people and stifled. All because of his past opposition to the CEO's personal relationships. I was speechless. Tone. The information. The details. It all pointed to me and Richard. And the most shocking part. At the end of the post was a line that read, "Update coming soon, with internal evidence." Someone was determined to get the whole story out. And if this post was confirmed, if my company was labeled as personal vendetta under the guise of professional management, we would lose a lot of pending contracts. Contracts that I had spent a year negotiating. I immediately called Mr. Richard into the office. He did not appear surprised. I asked directly, Did you write that article? He looked at me, coldly indifferent. I'm just telling the truth. I sighed, trying to stay calm. What do you think you're doing? Ruining your own reputation just to drag me down with you. He looked at me intently, then said slowly, You think you've won, right? You think making me work under you is enough to call it revenge. But you're wrong. Someone like you. Even if you're in the CEO's chair, you're still an unacceptable poor girl. And I'll make people see that you run this company with emotion. Not with reason. I was stunned. Not because he said it, but because I realized. This was no longer personal. This was a war, and he was using the media to distort it. Worse, he had been preparing for it all along. The evidence. I later discovered that he had saved internal emails, recorded several meetings with informal exchanges between team leaders, including some inappropriate jokes about him. He had built a dossier to create a victim of ageism and personal abuse story. And he knew better than anyone what the media loved. Drama. Downfall. Young female CEO success through revenge. That story was much more interesting than the truth. 3 days later, the update appeared. It was accompanied by a series of photos, audio files, and cleverly edited notes. Immediately, Twitter, TikTok, and LinkedIn began to talk. Some news sites had headlines like, Powerful young CEO or emotional manipulator, former boss exiled for forbidding son from dating poor people, startup accused of retaliating against previous generation, the world is turning upside down? I received a series of requests from the shareholders meeting. Partners temporarily suspended signing contracts. The media kept calling. I was prepared for everything, except that he would use his own past pain to create a story that turned me into a villain. And then, the real twist happened. Leaked video. In it, Mr. Richard, drunk at a gathering of friends, clearly said, Does she think that now that she has power, she can do whatever she wants? I will show her what is called ruined honor. I will let everyone see what kind of person she is. A poor girl who climbed high but forgot her roots. And worse, there was a passage where he bragged, I was playing chess, and she didn't know she was a pawn. The video was less than 3 minutes long, but it was a bomb. It spread faster than the accusation. People who had criticized me became suspicious. People who were neutral were shocked. And people who had believed in me were angry. I didn't need to speak up. Employees, people who had worked with him, began posting stories about his manipulation. His demeaning language toward women in boardrooms, his saying, I don't need to learn from anyone younger than my grandchild. A wave of backlash followed. And for the first time in his life, Richard felt what it was like to be swallowed up by public justice. The press turned around. The headlines now changed to, The revenge ambition turned out to be the ex-father's plan? The shocking secret. Who is the real victim? The man who forbade his son from falling in love is now unmasked by the young CEO he despised. In just 1 week, I didn't just regain my dignity. I regained my voice. And more than that, I showed the world that not everyone who comes from a high class has the right qualities. And not everyone who has ever been poor has to stay humble. I fire Mr. Richard. Not equal to a meeting. Not as good as a cold email. I invited him into my office and placed an envelope in front of him. Inside was the termination letter, along with all the evidence I had gathered, and a simple sentence. You are not being fired because of your past. You are not being ethical enough for the present. As he stood up, I looked into his eyes and saw the truth. No one can hide in the shell of a victim if inside is a villain. And this twist was not about revenge, but about ending a toxic era that began with contempt and toxic ego. I was a different person, and he saw it clearly. If you found this story to be a profound reminder that every action has a consequence, please like this video, subscribe to Judgy Tales, and turn on notifications. Because there are many more unexpected twists waiting for you. I thought that Mr. Richard's true face being revealed to the entire company, the online community, and the media would be the end of all the tragedies I had suffered because of him and his family. But I was wrong. Not because he still had a chance to fight back, but because I had not really completed the revenge that fate seemed to have prepared for me all these years. Part of me still felt not enough. Not because I hated him, but because I needed him to fully understand the price of contempt, of the times he called me the kind of girl who should never enter this house, of the dinners I had to leave in silence just because I was not classy enough to use their silver spoon. After Mr. Richard was fired from my company, I thought he would disappear from my life forever. But like a person who refuses to accept defeat, he started to cling to the pity of public opinion. But this time, no one listened to him anymore. The entire online community had seen his true face. But there was one person who had never spoken up from the beginning to the end. Ryan, my ex-lover. The person who once held my hand and swore to protect me from the world, but in the end chose to stay silent when his father humiliated me in front of me. The person who once let me leave that relationship without a word of appeal, just because he didn't want to disobey his parents. And then, as if life still had an unpaid debt, I received an email. I need to see you. It's Ryan. It's important. Give me 30 minutes. I spent almost 10 minutes staring at the screen. I should have deleted it. I shouldn't have heard anything else. But a part of me, the weak part that remained, wanted to look into his eyes, not to forgive him, but to see with my own eyes what the man who had chosen family over love had to say after all. We met at a quiet coffee shop. Ryan looked different. No longer cocky, no longer in the tailored suit his father had forced him into since he was 16. He was wearing a hoodie, his hair a little messy. His eyes looked at me. Regretfully. I'm sorry. I said nothing. No emotion. I know I was wrong. Not because of the company. Not because my father was exposed. But because I realized I lost you when you needed me the most. I remained silent. Because I knew now any apology would be too late. But then he continued, and what he said made me stop breathing. I left home. I lost contact with my parents. I turned down the family business. I started over. But today, it's not to ask you to come back. It's to say, you won. Not in the game. In your character. You don't have to put anyone down to stand tall. You just stand tall, and the world bows down. I left the bar with a feeling. Not of forgiveness, but of closure, relief. And now I was truly ready to do the final thing. The thing I had hesitated to do because I still had a part of my humanity left. But now I was certain. Mr. Richard needed more than a lesson. He needed to be removed from the seats of power he had once considered his throne. I hired a team of lawyers, the same ones who had helped me protect my intellectual property in previous deals. But this time I needed more than just legal advice. I needed investigative advice. We went through all of Richard's records from the 10 years he had been president of R. Corp., his family's conglomerate. And after 3 weeks, one of his former assistants, a woman he had forced to withdraw a harassment complaint, gave me a stack of documents, invoices, transactions, shady transfers to a subsidiary controlled by his nephew, and an old recording of him saying, "Don't let the auditors see that shit. As long as they trust me to pay my taxes on time, we're safe." I forwarded all documents to the Financial Investigation Agency. No need to mention my name. I sent them anonymously. But a few weeks later the news broke. R. Corp. Under investigation for 8-year tax fraud, linked to former chairman Richard C. His assets were frozen. His shares were temporarily seized. And the cruelest part. His family company had to sell 20% of its shares to investors to stay afloat. One investor was me. I used my own money from the company I had built, to buy back 20% of R. Corp. Without being CEO, I was still entitled to sit in on board meetings, to see every decision from the inside. And at the first meeting I showed up, the room was deathly silent. Richard, despite no longer having a title, was still sitting in a corner, as honorary advisor. When I walked in, he stared at me. I sat down, opened my laptop, and didn't say a word until the new chairman invited me to speak as a shareholder. I just say one sentence. There were chairs that were never meant for me, but time always knows how to turn around. Today I did not come to take revenge. I came to prove. Dignity does not need relatives to support it. It needs time and truth. The room applauded. Mr. Richard bowed his head. And I left the meeting without saying anything more. I don't need you to apologize. I don't need you to fall apart. I just need you to live in the company you used to run, see each person leave you, each piece of property no longer belong to you. And know that it all started because you thought, I wasn't good enough for your son. A week later I sold my shares, not because I didn't want to keep them, but because I had what I needed. I donated a portion of the proceeds to a scholarship fund for female students in technology. People who had been, like me, undervalued because of their background. I don't need to stand above anyone. I just need to stand in my own place. And prove. You don't need to be accepted to succeed. You just need to keep moving forward. And then, the world will have to learn to look at you with new eyes. If you think this revenge is enough to make justice stand tall, like the video, subscribe to Judgy Tales and turn on the bell so you don't miss any more stories. Because what you're about to hear next will shock you even more. Perhaps the strangest thing about stories like this isn't the twist, it's the spectacular payback, it's the final moment, when you sit back with nothing left to fight for and ask yourself, what did all this do to me, in the end? I had it all. I had proven my worth. I had risen above the contemptuous eyes, above the seemingly insurmountable shadows. The shadows of prejudice, of class, of that girl is not our class. I had made Richard, who once looked down on me, sit in a room where I was the largest shareholder. I had made a system that had turned its back on me look at me in a whole new light. But the moment I walked out of that building I didn't smile. I just felt calm. I didn't cry. I wasn't happy. I wasn't gloating. Because what I had just accomplished was no longer a revenge. It was a closure. A circle closed not to end anyone but to end my own pain. There are wounds that cannot be healed just by apologies. They can only be healed when we turn that pain into motivation to grow bigger, taller, stronger, and one day, come back not to trample on those who made us fall, but to prove that, even though they don't believe in us, we still live, still rise, and still retain our humanity. There was a time when I thought that to be respected, I needed recognition. But I was wrong. True respect does not come from how others see me. It comes from how I see myself. The day I chose to leave Ryan, I had nothing in my hands. I only had a small belief that, if I was good enough, persistent enough, then one day, the world that had turned its back on me would have to look back. Not to apologize, but to witness. Ryan is no longer in my life. Have no regrets. I have no resentment. Because without him, I would not have had a reason to leave my comfort zone, to start a journey to prove my worth without being attached to anyone. I used to think that love could overcome all barriers. But the truth is that love is not stronger than the pride of a family living in prejudice. And no one can save you from those barriers, except yourself. When I stopped waiting to be saved, that is when I started saving myself. I remember dinners at his family's, where I tried to use the right fork, sit properly, not talk too much, not laugh too loudly. All for fear of being judged. I remember his mother's glances when I told her I'd worked as a waitress to pay for school. I remember Richard asking me, "What did your parents do?" with a look that made me feel small. Those memories used to make me feel inadequate. But now I don't just feel adequate. I feel proud. Proud that I don't have to lie about where I came from. Proud that I have never used revenge to hurt innocent people. Proud that I choose to walk on my own 2 feet, instead of trying to cling to anyone. And that makes me realize, sometimes victory is not about who falls first, but who stays standing longer. This story isn't just about a failed relationship. It isn't just about an arrogant father or an incompetent son. It's about every person who has ever been judged by their looks, their background, their education, their profession, their way of speaking, the superficial things society uses to categorize people. It's a message to anyone who has ever been told they're not good enough. You don't have to be someone else to be accepted. You just have to be the best version of yourself. And the world will adjust. I didn't make this video to brag. I'm telling it so that someone out there, sitting in a cubicle rejected by a door, a scholarship, a company, a family, a love, knows that you are not alone. And that today's bad situation is not fate. It can be a beginning. If you allow yourself to get up. Life doesn't deal out fair things. But it does give us a choice in how we respond. I choose not to fall apart. Not to blame. Not to use bitterness to get even. I use my own success, clean, steady, self-respecting, to answer all the insults of the past. And that's what allows me to look in the mirror every morning without feeling ashamed. Mr. Richard will grow old. His fortune will no longer be his. His reputation will be in tatters. But I hope he will remember me, not as someone who didn't deserve it, but as the most valuable lesson he learned. Never underestimate a person because of where they come from. Because you never know who they will become. I don't need your apology. I don't need Ryan back. I don't need the world to approve of me. I just need to stay true to myself. And to me, that's the greatest victory. Today, if you're watching this video and feel this story resonates with you, stop for a moment. Ask yourself, who is making you feel like you're not good enough? And more importantly, how long have you allowed them to control your beliefs? Take it back. Stand up. Learn, do, fall, get up and keep going. Not to get revenge on anyone, but to save yourself from the shadow of doubt. Because in the end, the greatest lesson I ever learned didn't come from failure, but from how I overcame it. You don't have to be born at the finish line to get there first. You just don't stop in the middle of the road. And if anyone ever looks down on you, smile. They don't know that their contempt just fuels your fire. Fire to make you break through. Fire to make you fly. Fire to make you yourself. The version that no one expected. If you've made it this far, it means the story has made you pause and think. Maybe you see yourself in the looks of disdain, the cold words, or even the feeling of being left behind because you're not good enough. Maybe you've been in a relationship where you've always struggled to be accepted. Or maybe you've been in a situation where you had to prove your worth while everyone doubted you. But if this story has made you pause, made you fall silent, made your heart clench at some point, then perhaps you understand why we created Judgy Tales. This is more than just a storytelling channel. This is a place for the once ignored voices to be heard, for those who have been undervalued to tell their own story of rising above and stepping into the light. Each story here has a reason to exist. Not just to entertain, but to provoke, to move, to remind you that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom, but can come from a courageous ending by the people who have been hurt. And if you believe that such stories deserve to be shared, if you want to continue to accompany the journeys that are both dramatic, profound, and make people exclaim, "Oh my God, did he really do that?" then don't leave without liking, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell. The upcoming journeys will be even more intense, more surprising, and above all, so real that you will have to ask yourself, how would I handle it if I were in the middle of it? Become a part of the Judgy Tales community, where we listen, judge, learn, and together walk out of these stories with a new perspective. Because life is full of drama, it's just lacking people who dare to look straight at it and tell it with an uncompromising voice. Stay tuned because the next episode might be one you'll never forget. Ear listen. Balance scale judge. Beach balloon share your thoughts. This is Judgy Tales, and you're about to watch justice redefined.